It is there, in ancient Greece, that our story begins. With these words, Sheldon, the socially impaired theoretical physicist of the Big Bang Theory, begins his instruction of his academically challenged neighbour Penny, who wants to impress her boyfriend, Sheldon's roommate, by learning something about physics. Since all she wants to do is to pick up a few scraps of knowledge so that she can appear intelligent, she doesn't see the need to go all the way back to ancient Greece. Many people with an interest in political theory are as keen to begin with the here and now as Penny is, but in an even more alarming escalation on the Sheldon strategy, we're going to begin not in ancient Greece, but much, much further back. Our story begins with the appearance of Homo sapiens around 200,000 years ago. As in all such matters, dates and times are contested, but there appears to be a general consensus on this point. Around 30,000 BC, during the last Ice Age, Paleolithic, that is, Old Stone Age culture flourished. At this time, Great Britain was linked by a land bridge to the continent. Ireland was linked to Britain and Asia to North America. This Ice Age, the most recent of many such, ended about 12,000 years ago, and its end signalled the arrival of Mesolithic, that is, Middle Stone Age culture. The intercontinental land connections disappeared underwater when the sea levels rose, and the geographical configurations of our continents and our islands took on the shape that they have in large part retained to the present. Geologically speaking, we are still living in a warm interglacial period. Human beings are singularly badly constructed for survival. If the design of man was an engineering student's final year project, he might well find himself in academic trouble. Human beings are not, as are most animals, well adapted to a particular supportive environmental niche. In many ways, and in many places, man is a stranger in a strange land. The human infant is uniquely dependent upon its parents and is so for a very long period of time. Gordon Childe remarks that, in the case of human infants, the condition of dependence lasts exceptionally long. The hardening and solidification of the human skull are retarded longer than in other animals to allow for the greater expansion of the brain. At the same time, man is born with relatively few inherited instincts. In prehistoric times, pregnancy and the production of children was likely to be a constant condition for most women of childbearing age. The physically debilitating effects of pregnancy and the subsequent demands of childcare extended over a long time produced not only a differentiation of social function along sexual lines, but a need for stable pair bonding that resulted in the distinctively human form of social organization, that is, the family. Anthropological data show that the biological changes that have taken place in man in recent years, recent speaking geologically that is, have been either non-existent or negligible. Childe again. Since the time when skeletons of Homo sapiens first appear in the geological record, perhaps 25,000 years ago, man's bodily evolution has come virtually to a standstill, though his cultural progress was just beginning. Mumford remarks, biologically, man has developed further than other species because he had remained unspecialized. Omnivorous, free-moving, handy, omnicompetent, yet always somewhat unformed and incomplete, never fully adapting himself to any one situation, even though it might continue as long as the last Ice Age. Instead of cramping his activities by producing specialized organs to ensure effective adaptation, man put all his organic capital, so to say, into one feature of animal development that could invent substitutes for such specialized organs, the central nervous system. The basic biophysical conditions constraining man have not changed significantly since he first appeared on this earth. He has to eat, drink, seek shelter and companionship, mate, produce and rear children, and live in community with others. All these are human constants. Water he must find, food he must either find or produce, and he needs protection from wild beasts and from a frequently hostile natural environment. Given these constraints, life is hardly possible without a supportive social group, and the good life is impossible unless, as Aristotle says, one is either an animal or God, and man is neither. If man's recent biological changes have been negligible, the same cannot be said for the cultural, social and political changes that have taken place over the last 25,000 years, for these have been dramatic. Man's singular endowment is his mind, with its capacity for abstract thought linked in a way not fully understood with his massively developed brain. This development of the human brain made possible complex social behaviour, some of it good and, as we see later, some of it not so good. Human beings learn from each other not only by example but by means of language, itself a social product, perhaps the most significant social product of all. Speaking of our capacity for language, the American novelist and philosopher Walker Percy remarks that our capacity for language seems to be, in the evolutionary scale, a relatively recent, sudden and explosive development. It appears to have occurred in Neanderthal man as recently as 75,000 to 35,000 years ago. In evolutionary terms, our capacity for language is a relatively recent acquisition, something that occurred biologically yesterday. This capacity for language appears to be unique to man and, despite its mist-shrouded origin, uniquely constitutive of what man is. Human language is essentially social, both in origin and in function. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein showed definitively in his philosophical investigations that there could be no such thing as a language that could only in principle be known to only one person. Almost any statement you might care to make about prehistory is likely to be controversial. This is so for a number of reasons, not least the fact that it is prehistory, and so we have no access to written records. Even when there is evidence, archaeological and artifactual, its explanation is often merely conjectural and subject to revision. The renowned anthropologist Bruce Trigger remarks that the study of early civilizations often reminds me of the proverbial blind men trying to understand an elephant. Archaeologists and anthropologists talk about various ages, Old Stone Age, New Stone Age, Bronze, etc. But the change from one of these ages to the other did not take place instantaneously, nor did it take place everywhere at the same time. It must not be imagined, remarks Child, that at a given moment in the world's history a trumpet was blown in heaven, and every hunter from China to Peru thereupon flung aside his weapons and traps and started planting wheat or rice or maize, and breeding pigs and sheep and turkeys. Gordon Childe adapted the political idea of revolution to the study of prehistory. The first significant revolution was, he thought, the agricultural revolution associated with the Neolithic. This produced a major transformation of human economies, giving man control over his own food supply. What man did at this time was to plant, cultivate and improve by selection edible grasses, roots and trees, and to domesticate certain species of animal in return for the fodder he was able to offer, the protection he could afford and the forethought he could exercise. This revolution in human culture, and I do not think it an exaggeration to call it a revolution, provided for those human beings who adopted it a relatively more secure source of food than did hunting and gathering or simple pastoralism, and crucially, for the first time permitted them to settle permanently in one place. The increased productivity resulting from this first agricultural revolution made possible a more sophisticated division of labour than that which allocated hunting tasks to men and gathering tasks to women, and for the first time in human history, a significant number of people were released from the time-consuming burden of earning their livings by the sweat of their brows. Colin Renfrew asks the searching question: if the arrival of the new species, Homo sapiens, with its higher level of cognitive capacity, its new kinds of behaviour, its sophisticated use of language, its enhanced self-consciousness, was so significant, why did it take so long for these really impressive innovations, seen in the accompanying agricultural revolution, to come about? What accounts for the huge gap from the first appearance of Homo sapiens in Europe 40,000 years ago and earlier in Western Asia to the earliest agricultural revolution in Western Asia and Europe of 10,000 years ago? The assumption is made that people in hunter-gatherer societies lived a precarious existence from hand to mouth and readily embraced the Neolithic Revolution. But this assumption might be ungrounded. As Marshall Sahlins points out, there are two possible courses to affluence. Wants may be easily satisfied by producing much or desiring little, so that either option appears reasonable. Despite the long history of man on this planet, his economic situation on average would seem to have changed little from our first beginnings until the start of the 19th century. The average person in the world of 1800 was no better off than the average person of 100,000 BC. The average man in the industrial or post-industrial West is now somewhat between 10 to 20 times richer than its 1800 forebears. It is true that before 1800 a small number of elite people had rich and wealthy lifestyles, but we're concerned with the average. It might be offered against these claims that the agricultural revolution surely changed things for the better. In a sense, that's true. Productivity increased, but so did the population, so that apart from the wealthy elite, no one was substantially better off. There was a dramatic increase in population, but the average standard of living did not increase as it has done in the last 200 years. On the other hand, it can be argued against such assailants that changing climatic conditions made the life of the hunter-gatherer progressively more difficult. With the retreat of the ice, the forests advanced and reduced the area of land available for animal grazing, so that man had little choice but to adapt or die. Instead of its being, as often portrayed, an inexplicable transition of intellectual brilliance to move towards the cultivation of plants, or not if you adopt Sahlins' perspective, it was really a matter of practical necessity. Davidson and Rees-Mogg make precisely this point. They write, "The transition to agriculture was not a choice of preference, but an improvisation adopted under duress to make up for shortfalls in the diet." Was the transition to the Neolithic a matter of choice, good or bad, or a necessity? Who can tell for sure? Were our early pre-agricultural societies Edenic oases of equality, or were they the scenes of brutal and primitive violence? We'll examine this question in the next lecture.